Hello and welcome back to the Art of Argumentation PowerPoint. Part 2 is only going to take you through two different skills, which is the structure of an argument, whether it's deductive or inductive, and finding unstated assumptions. Even though it's only two skills, these are some of the harder ones for students, so I wanted to make sure I had ample time to explain them. So let's begin with structure. What type of reasoning is the author using to support their conclusion? There are two main types. The first type is deductive. And when I say deductive reasoning, I want you to think of Sherlock Holmes. By observing the clues around him and based on all his prior knowledge from other cases, he's able to quickly come to conclusions. So deductive argument follows this strict reasoning from one premise to another. And usually there's two premises followed by conclusion. Think of them as reasons, but premises tend to be more observational. A good deductive argument, however, has to have really sound premises. Just because the flow makes sense doesn't mean it's automatically a strong argument. You have to make sure that all the premises are actually correct and not some false assertion. Classically, a deductive argument is known as a syllogism. This has the mathematical equivalent of the following. If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A must equal C. If you're not quite mathematically inclined, let me give you an example. One of them which is valid and the other which is not. Socrates is a man, A equals B. All men are mortal, B equals C. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, A equals C. This one makes perfect sense. The logic all flows one to the next and all the premises are valid. Look at this one though. Socrates is mortal, A equals B. All men are mortal, B equals C. Therefore, Socrates is a man, A equals C. In this case, this one's invalid. You can't actually prove this because if you look at the second premise, all men are mortal, they're making the assumption that only men are mortal. Only with that assumption would the last statement work. Inductive reasoning is more about predictions based on facts, especially polls and studies. So it's not as deterministic as deductive. It's much more about probability. So you observe results that occur time and time again, you establish patterns, and then based on those well-tested patterns, you can come to a conclusion. So it's going to rely, like I said, studies, polls, personal examples. Very easy example. In the US, most pregnant teenagers do not graduate from high school. How do I know that though? Because I've looked at studies, I've looked at research, I've looked at psychologist interviews of several young girls, and we also have the statistic that only 40% graduate. So this is inductive reasoning. There is a slight connection between the two. Oftentimes that first premise of a deductive argument is based on an observation from induction. So for example, again, Sherlock Holmes, because he's solved so many different crimes, he has all these past observations to go after. But for the most part, he relies on his deductive abilities, less so on research, statistics, examples. So a quick little rundown that'll simplify how to tell a passage from either a deductive or inductive. Honestly, the easiest clue is that in induction, we'll tend to have a lot of evidence or examples in almost every single paragraph. So doing a quick scan of the passage and looking to see if it does have a lot of evidence or examples. It doesn't have to be all statistical or all numerical. It could just be if I'm doing something about pregnant teenagers and I just base it on examples from different girls, that is still inductive. Sometimes they're also a little more balanced. They're less harsh in saying you should do this or you should not do that. They may admit the other side. Deductive will have very little evidence or examples. Most of the passages will not, most of the paragraphs, will not. There'll be a lot of intermediate conclusions, and it doesn't really present a balanced argument because the whole point of deductive is that you're coming towards a very certain conclusion. So it does not really acknowledge the other side, or it may just dismiss the other side. So for example, I'm going to show you two passages from paper 1. These are past papers about hosting international sporting events like the Olympics or the World Cup and whether or not they're beneficial. So what I said was to look at the paragraphs, just kind of scan them. Do you see evidence? Do you see examples? And when you look at document 1, I scan the first, the second, the third. I'm really only seeing one evidence right there, where it says under 1% of experts come from small and medium-sized businesses. That's it. And then when I look at some of the reasoning, okay, the Olympics will be good, the World Cup will be good for Brazil because then hotels and stores will have employees who will have to learn English. If they learn English, then tourists coming will be pleased. If tourists are pleased, then they'll return even after the Olympics. So you can see it follows that if A equals B, B equals C, then A equals C kind of scenario. So that's why this one is deductive. Now you look at the second document and you do the same exact thing. You want to look at each paragraph, and what you'll quickly notice, evidence after example after example. So for example, in that second paragraph, they talk about the amount of people who've been displaced as countries or cities get ready for major sporting events. So here, 2 million people in total. In Brazil alone, 1.5 million people were forced to relocate. It also has specific examples of stadiums and mentions Cape Town and Beijing. The Bird Nest Stadium just became a tourist attraction. And then it goes into specific numerical totals for the cost. So when you put all that together, clearly this isn't being based on deduction on one thing following the next. It's based on evidence and past patterns to determine if it's worthwhile to host an international sporting event. So in that case, that's inductive. So the main thing is to scan it paragraph by paragraph and see if there's a lot of evidence or examples. If not, it's based on premises. One thing I need to stress, inductive doesn't make it necessarily better, because all of this great evidence, if it's not well sampled, if it's generalized, if it's not based from experts, may not be that strong. Deductive could be strong if all the premises are valid. So just be careful on how you assess it, but we'll get to that more once we've reviewed the entire PowerPoint. Just keep in mind how you tell the difference between deductive and inductive. Moving on to assumptions. Warning, this is one of the hardest things for students to figure out in the beginning. I honestly would say that it takes about the second quarter for students to really start to get it. So if at the beginning of this you're having a hard time, give yourself some slack. It's okay. It takes all students usually some time to just master this. Because the reason an assumption is so difficult is that it's not in the passage. It's not like a main conclusion that I can just spot at the end of the passage. It's unstated. That's why it's an assumption. So you have to ask yourself, what other reason would I have to agree with in order for me to agree to the author's main conclusion? What else am I missing here that sounds kind of fishy, but that the author just assumes it to be true, that they didn't even write it down? So this is one of the first flaws that you assess in an argument that can greatly weaken the conclusion of a source. One way that I think might be helpful to grasp an assumption is that it's a missing reason. Think that the argument has a big blank in it somewhere. The author feels that this reason is so obvious, there's no reason to even write it down or to state it. So I'm going to provide you here with a very simple argument that has a blank line. The blank line is where the assumption would have been written if the author thought it was necessary. But because they think it's so obvious, they didn't write it down. Several studies have shown that stress has beneficial consequences. Blank. This is where the assumption would have gone had the author written it down. So rather than discouraging students from taking fewer ACE courses, counselors should push students to take more. So they're trying to prove you should take as many classes as possible because stress is really great for you. You guys might have thoughts about that. But the point here, what else do I have to agree with in order for this to make sense? And what I have to agree with is that ACE courses cause stress, right? So that's what an assumption is. One of the ways you can check if you're like, I think this is the assumption, but I'm not sure, is to get the assumption you think you found, ACE courses cause stress, and make an opposite statement out of it. ACE courses do not cause stress. If by reversing it, now the argument falls apart, you know that you did find an assumption in the argument, ACE courses cause stress. For example, Reffy and Alan got married last week, but Reffy was only marrying Alan because she wants a stable home for her children. She shouldn't have done that since it's not fair to Alan. He deserves a wife who really loves him. The author's giving all these reasons why Alan didn't deserve for that to happen to him. But it's all based on a huge assumption. And that assumption is that Reffy does not love Alan. Notice it's nowhere stated in the passage. The author just assumes it to be true. So I think I found it. Let me reverse it. Let me make that statement the opposite. And the opposite would be Reffy does love Alan. Does the reverse statement of my assumption now disprove the entire argument? Yeah, it does. Because if she does love Alan, then of course they should get married and then they'll have children. There's nothing wrong with wanting a stable family for your children. So that's a little test to see. It's kind of like when you do a math problem and then you do the opposite, like you're doing division and then you multiply to make sure that your answer is actually correct. That's all a reverse test is. Let's do a few more. Handguns should be outlawed so there's less crime in the streets. What are they assuming about handguns and crimes? The assumption is that they're the main cause of crime. Next, students who don't participate in campus activities should not have to pay student fees. This is a little trickier. Think of student fees. What assumption are they making about student fees and campus activities? And what they're assuming is that student fees mostly pay for campus activities. When you actually look into it, student fees also pay for parking, also pay for access to the gym, also pay for security, so on and so forth. So when you reverse that and you realize student fees do not mostly pay for campus activities, they pay for a bunch of other things, you know you found an assumption. Thirdly, schools could hire better teachers if they got rid of all their athletic programs. Well, the big assumption here is with the teachers. They're saying could hire better. So what are they assuming about their current teachers? Well, that they're not very good. And if you reverse that, and then it disproves the whole argument, you have indeed found an assumption. Lastly, abortion is murder. Murder is unlawful and morally reprehensible. Thus, abortion is immoral and should be banned. Notice this is a deductive argument. If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. And this is really at the heart of the debate over abortion, and it's unstated. The author feels like it's so obvious, how could you deny this? But the assumption is that a fetus is alive. And a lot of people contest that. So if you reverse that and it disproves the main argument here, you know you indeed have found an assumption. So you're going to do several activities to help you through this, but again, take your time. Think of the blank space somewhere in the argument where they're just making this unasserted statement that may be false, and keep working on finding assumptions. Quick review. What's the first thing you do when you read a document? You find the main conclusion. The second thing is look for the intermediates and the evidence and examples. What about when you start to assess if a document is strong or weak? What should be the first thing you assess? Raven, the reliability of a source. The second thing is what we learned about today first, the structure. Is it inductive or deductive? And the first type of flaw to look for are assumptions, because they are very common in many arguments. All right, so good luck, and I will help you through this whole process as we slowly build on all the skills you need for global perspectives. Thanks for tuning in.